Hey, how's it going? This is Mark Hamrock with Hamrock Music. In this lesson today, we're going to be looking at audio compression. What is it? How do you use it? Why do you use it? Audio compression, along with equalization, is probably the most commonly used processing across all tracks when you're mixing. So if you're wondering how to get a professional mix, you really need to understand how compression works. In our example, I'm going to be using DMG Track Comp because it's laid out pretty simply and it has all the functions that we need to understand when using compression. So here I have a drum beat that we're going to be listening to. It's just a kick, snare, and hi-hat. Let's go ahead and give that a listen to without the compression on it. All right, you get the idea. So first of all, what does compression do? Compression basically brings down the overall level of the loudest parts of your recording. So if we look at the drum track here, we can see the individual hits of the kick and the snare drum. So right there, that's a snare hit. And if I play it, you can hear it. Right? So you have a snare hit, you have kick, kick, snare. And as you can see, you have these pretty sharp peaks or transients that are happening there, and then it dies out real quick, and it's a pretty low level here. So you have these pretty sharp attacks with high transient peaks, and then a lot lower of a level. So what we can do is we can compress this signal to bring down these peaks, and then we can boost the overall level of the track to make it sound louder. So let's dive in and unbypass our compressor and start talking about some of the different controls of the compressor. So first of all, we have the input level, which just controls how much signal is going into the compressor. So if I play our track and then I turn up the input level, you'll obviously hear it getting louder, and you'll see on the meters the signal is getting louder as well. Okay, so I'll set that back at 0. The next control that we'll talk about is the threshold. So the threshold sets the level at which the compressor starts to work. So if we look at our drum track playing there, we can see it's going up to about -6 dB at the most. And so if I set the threshold to -5 dB, it's not going to affect the level yet. But when I start getting to -6 and below that, let's say -10, the compressor is going to compress the level above that threshold. It'll start working on the level above that threshold. So let me do this. We're going to, before I talk about the ratio, I'm going to set it to a very high ratio so you can hear an exaggeration of how the compressor sounds. And so what I'll do is I'm going to set it there, and then I'll bring the threshold down. And then what you'll see is once I start getting -10, -12, you'll start to see the gain reduction happening right here in the red levels below. So that's showing you the amount of gain reduction happening up to almost -6 dB. So the ratio setting controls how much the signal will be processed once it goes above the threshold. Let me say that again. The ratio controls how much the signal will be compressed once it goes above the threshold. So basically, if you have a higher ratio, it's going to compress the signal more than if you have a lower ratio. If I set the ratio to 1:1, then it's not going to compress the signal at all. So if I set the ratio to a 2:1 setting, then what that means is that for every 2 dBs that goes over the threshold, the compressor is only going to allow 1 dB over the threshold. So for example, if the signal goes over the threshold by 10 dB, the compressor is going to reduce it, so you're only getting 5 dB above the threshold. Let's try another example. Let's say if we set it to a 5:1 ratio, then what that means is that for every 5 dBs of signal over the threshold, it's going to be reduced to 1 dB over the threshold. So now if the signal's over 10 dBs above the threshold, it's going to be reduced to 2 dBs above the threshold. The way I would think about it is the higher the ratio, the more compression you're getting. If I go all the way up to infinity to 1, what that means is basically the compressor's acting like a limiter. There's no signal going above the threshold. So if I play the track again here, I'm at infinity. So right now the threshold's at 0. The signal's not being affected at all. If I bring it down, you're going to hear it really getting reduced there. So before we talk about attack and release settings, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example here of an extremely compressed signal. And so let me play this again here. I'm going to loop our track. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the threshold down again. Okay, so our signal is getting pretty squashed here. Now what's also happening is the overall level's a lot lower. So the next control I'm going to talk about is what's called the makeup gain. And so on track comp, it's called auto gain. And what I can do is I can turn on makeup. And so what that does is it brings the level back up to match the original uncompressed signal. And so if I play it again, you'll see that makeup working and the level is now louder. Now, what would that look like? Well, let's take a look. So I have this track here, and let's take a look at them together. So as you can see, here's the squash signal here. As you can see, those transients are gone, but there's more sustain. There's more level going on right there, right? So if we play that track, so you can hear that those peaks are reduced, but there's more of the room noise. There's more of everything else besides those transients going on. It's a lot bigger sound. So that's how compression can make a track sound a lot louder and in your face and closer to you, more present, up in your face, than not using compression. So let's hear those two tracks compare to each other. Here's the non-compressed signal. So again, you hear the transients, the sharp peaks a lot more. Here's a super compressed signal. Less of the peaks, more of everything else though, right? More of the room noise, and it just sounds bigger, fatter sounding. Now, I would never use that setting on this. I typically go with a lower ratio setting, usually about 4:1, but it all kind of depends. So let's hear what that sounds like. Not quite as extreme, right? Okay, so let's talk about the attack and the release. The attack is the amount of time it takes for the compressor to work on the input signal once it gets above the threshold. So let's hear that in action. I'm going to turn the attack all the way down to 0 milliseconds, which means that it's going to begin working immediately on the signal. And then I'm going to put the ratio way up there and really exaggerate it so you can hear that. Okay, so as you can hear, that initial peak or transient is really getting squashed there. Now what I'll do is I'll turn the attack time up and you'll start to hear that transient peak pop through more. And it'll sound a lot punchier. So right there, you start to really hear it pop through. Right? So it's super, super punchy sounding there. So what's happening there is that the compressor is letting through that initial peak of the signal, and then it's not working till a little bit later in the attack time. So you're still letting some of that peak signal through, transient, but then you still retain some of that bigness overall. So then let's talk about the release. So the release works on the flip side, and what that does is it determines the amount of time it takes for the signal to return back to normal once it goes back below the threshold. So let's hear what that sounds like. So I'm going to set quicker attack time, and then I'll start with a real fast release. Now what's going to happen is you're going to really see it in the gain reduction red levels there. So as you can see, it's super fast. And then as I turn the release time up, it holds the signal more. So at some point around here, it'll start to sound a little smoother, but then it starts to really breathe and pump. So you can hear that pumping effect. So on the track comp here, we also have an output, which just sets the output level, pretty self-explanatory. We're not going to worry too much about these other settings here, RMS, knee, soft knee compared to hard knee. A soft knee setting just has a little bit more smoother sound, whereas a hard knee is more of an immediate effect on the signal. Makeup we talked about, dry, wet, so that's the mix level, and we're doing 100% there. So if you want to do parallel compression, I could do that all on the same track by turning this down to whatever, however much I want. So that basically lets some of the unprocessed signal through as well as the affected signal.